Welcome to Fiery Nights, where the darkest stories unfold in the stillness of the night. Where are you listening from tonight? Are you safely curled up in your room or perhaps surrounded by the noise of others? Or maybe you find yourself in a quiet, haunting place alone with your thoughts and the whispers of something far more sinister. Wherever you are, I invite you to settle in. Tonight's tale will take you into the heart of darkness, a place where the line between the living and the dead is thin, and the silence is deafening. Story 1. The basement was always off limits. It wasn't because of any specific reason. The house, though old, seemed perfectly fine. The walls were sturdy, the windows were intact, and the foundation was solid. But there was something about that basement. It was as though it was holding a secret, a deep, lingering darkness that no one could quite explain. It wasn't that the basement was dark. Every house with a basement had that. It was the unnatural kind of darkness, the kind that felt alive, as though it were reaching, stretching, just waiting to swallow anything that dared to step too close. The air was always colder down there, even in the height of summer. The shadows in the basement were deeper than shadows should ever be. But it wasn't until the day that the house was sold that the truth about those shadows would be uncovered. The house had been sitting empty for months. The previous owners had left without a word, a curious thing in a town where everyone knew everyone's business. The neighbors said they'd seen them packing up one afternoon and driving away. There was no notice, no goodbye, just an empty house at the end of the street. And with it, the house had passed into the hands of someone else, someone who wasn't afraid of its past. The new owner, a young woman named Sarah, was excited about the fresh start. She didn't mind the idea of renovating an old house. She had always loved the charm of aged wood and stone, the creaks and groans of a house that had lived for decades. But from the moment she stepped into the house, there was something off. It wasn't the dusty floors or the cobwebs in the corners. It wasn't even the stale air that lingered in the rooms. No, it was something else entirely. Something about the basement. There was no real reason why Sarah felt drawn to it. The door was locked as it had been since she first arrived, and yet she found herself standing in front of it often, her hand hovering over the handle. She could feel the coldness from underneath the door, seeping up through the wood, like the basement itself was trying to push its way out. One evening, after a long day of unpacking, Sarah finally gathered the courage to open the door. She had heard the stories, of course, the ones the neighbors whispered when they thought no one was listening, the ones that spoke of strange happenings, of noises in the night, of shadows that moved when no one was around. But Sarah didn't believe in ghosts. She was a practical woman after all. The door creaked open, its old hinges groaning in protest. The stairs leading down into the basement were steep and narrow, cloaked in a thick darkness that seemed to swallow the light from the hallway. She fumbled for the light switch at the top of the stairs, but when she flipped it, nothing happened. The bulb was dead. The basement seemed to breathe in the silence, exhaling a cold draft that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. Despite the chill, she descended, her footsteps echoing in the stillness. The basement was larger than she had anticipated, stretching far back into the dark, with old boxes and forgotten furniture scattered across the floor. But it wasn't the clutter that made Sarah uneasy. It was the shadows. They were thicker down here, darker, as though they had a life of their own. They twisted and stretched across the walls, moving slowly, as if aware of her presence. For a moment, Sarah stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the feeling, but it lingered. She stepped forward, her foot landing on something soft, a pile of old newspapers. And then, there was a noise, a soft scrape, as though something or someone had just shifted in the dark. She turned quickly, her eyes darting around the basement, trying to pinpoint the source. Nothing. Only the deep shadows that seemed to move just beyond the reach of her vision. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling despite herself. "Is someone down here?" No answer. Just silence. But then the whispers started. At first, it was just a faint rustling, like the wind blowing through the cracks in the house. But then it grew clearer, low, indistinct murmurs. Words she couldn't quite make out, but they sounded like a language she didn't understand. Sarah took a step back, her foot catching on something, a broken chair. She stumbled but caught herself. Her breathing had quickened and her heart raced in her chest. The whispers grew louder. "Get out! Leave! Help!" Sarah froze. She wasn't imagining this. The shadows on the walls seemed to grow, stretching toward her, reaching out like fingers in the dark. She could hear the scratching now too, faint and rhythmic, like something was crawling beneath the floorboards, something that didn't belong. Without thinking, she bolted for the stairs, her legs trembling as she scrambled up the steps, her hand grabbing the railing for support. She didn't dare look back, but she could feel it. Those eyes in the darkness, watching her, waiting for her to fall. The whispers followed her, trailing behind her like a cold wind. When she reached the top of the stairs, she slammed the basement door shut behind her. Her heart pounded in her chest, her breath ragged. She leaned against the door, trying to calm herself. But she couldn't shake the feeling that the basement was still there, just beyond the door, still watching. She never went back down there, but the shadows didn't stay in the basement. Every night when Sarah lay in bed, she could hear them. The whispers, the scraping, the soft shuffle of something moving across the floor. It wasn't just the basement now, it was the whole house. The shadows had begun to creep into every room, wrapping themselves around her like a suffocating fog. No matter how many lights she turned on, no matter how much she tried to push them back, they followed her just out of sight, moving at the edges of her vision. And they weren't just shadows anymore. They were something more. Story 2. The house was a relic of a time long past. Its windows were fogged with age, the shutters rattling in the breeze as though they were trying to escape. The walls, once painted with bright colors, had faded to a dull gray. The plaster cracked in places, revealing the worn wooden beams beneath. The floors creaked underfoot, a steady reminder of the house's age. But it was the basement that kept the house alive, or rather, the shadows that resided there. Anna had always been drawn to the house ever since she was a little girl. It sat at the edge of the street, its overgrown yard encroaching on the sidewalk. Her friends would dare each other to go close, but none of them would ever cross the threshold. They all knew the stories, the ones about the shadows that haunted the house, the ones about the people who disappeared after spending too long in the basement. But Anna didn't believe in ghosts. She didn't believe in the stories that swirled around the house like fog. She had always assumed the shadows were just that, shadows. But as an adult, when she finally had the chance to move into the house, those childhood fears bubbled to the surface once more. The first night she spent in the house, Anna noticed something strange. The house was quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence that felt oppressive, like it was pressing down on her chest. But it wasn't just the silence. It was the way the shadows seemed to shift, moving in the corners of her vision. They seemed to stretch, growing longer with every passing moment, twisting and turning like living things. The walls felt too close, as though they were shrinking. Anna tried to push the thoughts away. It was an old house. It had character. It had quirks. There was nothing supernatural about it. But the basement. The door to the basement stood at the end of the hall, its heavy wooden frame looking even darker in the dim light. It was locked when she first moved in, but she had the key. That night, she told herself, she would go down. She would face the fear. The basement door groaned as she opened it, the smell of mildew and rot flooding her senses. The staircase led down into the inky blackness, the walls lining the stairs covered in layers of dust. Anna's footsteps echoed as she descended, her heart beating faster with every step. The air grew colder as she reached the bottom of the stairs, and a heavy stillness hung in the air. She turned on the light. but the bulb flickered and buzzed before giving out entirely. The shadows in the room were darker than before, thicker, as if they had a life of their own. They twisted and stretched across the walls, moving slowly, as if aware of her presence. For a moment, Anna stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the feeling, but it lingered. She stepped forward, her foot landing on something soft, a pile of old newspapers, and then a voice, low and raspy, echoed in the basement. "Leave." The voice was distorted, like it had come from the walls themselves. It sent a chill through her body, but she shook it off. There was nothing here, just shadows. "Leave now." Anna turned around, but there was no one there. Just darkness. But then she saw it. In the far corner of the room where the shadows were darkest, there was something moving. Something crawling. It was too fast to be human, its form shifting like liquid darkness. She froze, her breath caught in her throat, and then the shadows reached out, touching her, pulling at her. It was like they were alive, wrapping around her arms, tugging at her clothes. The shadows were no longer just shadows. They were something else, something that wanted to pull her into the darkness with them. "Get out." The voice screamed again, louder, more desperate. Anna stumbled backward, but the shadows wouldn't let her go. They crawled over her skin, seeping into her mind, filling her thoughts with dread. The room seemed to close in on her, suffocating her. With one last scream, she ran for the stairs, pulling herself up them as fast as she could. The shadows followed, but when she reached the top, they stopped. The door slammed shut behind her, and the house was still again. But Anna knew the shadows would be waiting. They always were. Story 3. The house had always been quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that gnawed at the edges of your mind, making you question whether there was something hidden beneath the silence. Nestled at the edge of the woods, the old house stood stoically, its peeling paint and crumbling stone walls a testament to a bygone era. It had been abandoned for years, but every time someone ventured too close, the air seemed to grow colder, as though the house itself were warning them away. And then there was the basement. It had always been locked, the heavy iron door rusted shut, but there was something about it that drew people in, something they couldn't quite explain. The house was full of whispers, rumors about the family that had once lived there, how they had mysteriously disappeared, vanishing without a trace. But the rumors weren't what had kept everyone away. It was the basement and the shadows that lived there. When the house was finally sold, the new owners, a young couple named Claire and Greg, were eager to start fresh. They knew the house had a history, but that wasn't enough to deter them. They had dreams of restoring it, making it their own. The moment they moved in, however, something didn't feel right. It wasn't just the old walls or the creaky floors. It was the air. There was something thick in it, something heavy and oppressive. The shadows, too, seemed darker here, as if they were waiting. The basement door was still locked when they arrived, but Claire found the key in an old drawer, buried beneath stacks of paperwork. She didn't think much of it at first. Curiosity got the better of her when one afternoon, while Greg was out, she stood before the basement door, holding the key in her hand. It felt cold, even though it was a warm day. With a soft click, the door opened, and the staleness of the air rushed out like a suffocating breath. It smelled of mildew and rot, but there was something more. A deeper, more unsettling odor. Something that reminded her of old, forgotten things. The stairs leading down were narrow, each one creaking under her weight as she descended. The basement was large, stretching far beyond what she could see, shrouded in an unnatural darkness. It wasn't the darkness of a basement, no, this was something more. The shadows here seemed thicker, darker, swirling as though they were alive. Claire stood at the bottom of the stairs, frozen. She couldn't explain it, but she felt it. Something in the air had shifted. The shadows seemed to watch her, their very presence wrapping around her like a blanket. Then she heard it. A faint whisper. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, but then it came again, louder this time. "Help! Help me!" The voice was so faint, so desperate. Claire's heart raced and she felt a chill run down her spine. The whisper seemed to be coming from all around her, from the walls, from the shadows themselves. "Help me!" It was coming closer. Claire stepped back, her legs trembling as she turned to leave. But as she did, the shadows seemed to shift. The walls of the basement creaked, groaned, and then a loud crash echoed through the space. Something moved. Something was there. She rushed up the stairs, slamming the door behind her. Her heart was pounding, her breath ragged. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed her up from the basement. She wasn't alone in the house anymore. That night, as Claire lay in bed, she heard it again. The whisper. But this time, it wasn't coming from the basement. It was coming from the hallway outside her bedroom door. "Sonad, and then clearer. Help me." Claire bolted upright in bed, her breath catching in her throat. The shadows under the door stretched unnaturally long, as though they were reaching toward her. She could hear the faint rustling, the soft scrape of something moving in the darkness. The whisper grew louder. "Help me! Help me!" Her heart raced, and she could feel the weight of the air pressing down on her. The shadows in her room grew deeper, more tangible, as though they were moving, shifting. It was as if they were alive, waiting, watching. She couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing her phone, she dialed Greg's number, her hands shaking, but the line was dead. Static filled the air as she listened, the shadows now encroaching on her bed. She didn't dare look, but the whispers were growing closer, almost as if they were circling around her. And then, there was a sudden bang at the door. She screamed, scrambling back into the corner of the bed, but the door didn't open. The whispers stopped. The silence that followed was worse. The shadows in the room seemed to pulse, slowly closing in, as though the very walls were suffocating her. The next morning, Claire was gone. Greg arrived home to find the house silent, his wife nowhere to be found. The basement door was open, but the shadows were deeper than before, as if they had taken her. He stood at the top of the stairs, staring into the abyss below, and the whispers began again. Story 4. It was the smell that first drew him in. The musty, sour stench of old books and dust, the kind that lingered in the air long after the light had faded. Jack had never meant to enter the basement. In fact, he had avoided it for months, ever since moving into the old house on Maple Street. But tonight, something was different. It had been a long day of unpacking, settling in, trying to get used to the creaks of the house and the way the floorboards groaned beneath him. The house was old, too old for someone like Jack, who was used to newer, sturdier homes. But it had charm, and, in a strange way, it felt like home. Except for the basement. The door had always been locked, and Jack hadn't thought much of it until tonight. As he passed by the basement door, the key caught his eye, lying on the counter where he had left it earlier. Without thinking, he grabbed it and descended the stairs. The basement door opened with a creak, and the smell hit him immediately. A mixture of mildew, rotting wood, and something else. Something faintly metallic. The stairs were steep and narrow, the wood worn smooth from years of use. The basement itself was vast, filled with old furniture covered in sheets, stacked boxes, and forgotten relics of the house's past. But there was something more in the air, something palpable. It was as though the shadows in the basement were thicker, heavier, as if they were hiding something just beyond his sight. Jack hesitated at the bottom of the stairs, a strange unease creeping up his spine. The room seemed to stretch out before him, dark and foreboding. He reached for the light switch, but when he flipped it, nothing happened. The basement remained cloaked in darkness, and a chill seeped into his bones. And then he heard it. A soft rustling sound, like something, or someone, shifting in the dark. He stood still, listening. His heart beat faster and his palms grew slick with sweat. "Hello?" he called, his voice sounding hollow in the vast, empty space. Nothing answered. But then, the shadows in the corner of the basement shifted. Slowly, imperceptibly, they seemed to grow, stretching toward him. He backed up, but something stopped him. A sudden, cold gust of air from the far corner. And then, the voice. It was faint, barely audible. But there, low, hollow, like it came from deep within the earth. "Come closer." Jack's breath caught in his throat. The voice was coming from the darkest corner of the basement, and though every fiber of his being screamed for him to run, he found his legs moving forward. The shadows seemed to stretch with him, curling, twisting as if they were following him. "Come closer," the voice repeated. It sounded older now, more desperate, as if it had been waiting for years, decades even, waiting for someone to listen. Jack stepped forward, drawn toward the darkness. The shadows wrapped around him, thickening, making the air harder to breathe. He could barely see anything now, the darkness consuming him. And then, the feeling. A cold, icy hand brushed against his skin, and Jack gasped, freezing in place. The shadows weren't just around him. They were inside him, crawling into his mind, filling him with dread. The basement no longer felt like a room. It felt like a living thing, breathing, suffocating him. And then, as suddenly as it had started, everything went still. The shadows receded and the air felt empty. He was no longer surrounded by the heaviness, the whispers. He blinked, and the basement was just as it had been before. Quiet, dark, and still. But Jack wasn't alone anymore. The whispers would follow him forever. The shadows had found him. Story 5. The house had always been a mystery, even to those who had lived in it. Its origins were lost in time, and it had stood for centuries, shrouded in fog and rumors. The house on Redwood Lane was large, crumbling, and dark, a place where the wind never seemed to settle, and the shadows seemed to creep a little too far. But it wasn't the house itself that kept the neighbors at bay. It was the basement. No one dared to enter, not after the stories. The last family who had lived there vanished without a trace. One day they were there, and the next their belongings were abandoned, the house left to stand in the silence of time. The only evidence that remained of them was a single decaying photograph on the mantel of the fireplace. The townsfolk whispered that the basement had something to do with it. Some said it was cursed, others claimed it was home to something far worse. But stories are just that. Stories. And for Henry, a young man eager for adventure, the allure of the house was too strong to resist. He had heard the rumors when he first moved into the town. People would hush when he walked by, casting uneasy glances at him. But Henry never believed in the supernatural. He had been raised on facts, science, and reason. The house on Redwood Lane was just that, a house. And the basement? Just a basement. Henry had been living in the house for nearly a week before he mustered the courage to investigate the basement. The door, old and heavy, had a rusted lock, but it was nothing Henry couldn't overcome. He found the key in a dusty drawer, hidden in a pile of old papers left behind by the previous owners. The air in the house had been thick, a musty odor lingering in the corners, but it was the basement that held his curiosity. He wasn't sure what he expected to find, but the thrill of uncovering a mystery was irresistible. The door creaked as he unlocked it, revealing a steep staircase leading down into a thick, impenetrable darkness. The air grew colder the closer he got to the stairs, a biting chill that sank deep into his bones. There was a faint smell of decay, like something long dead, but Henry shook it off as the house's age. He flicked on the light switch, but the bulb flickered and buzzed before going out entirely. Without the light, the darkness seemed to consume him, pressing down on him with a weight that felt suffocating. He had to force himself to take the first step. his breath shallow and quick as he descended. Each creak of the stairs was louder than the last, echoing in the silence of the house like a warning. The moment he reached the bottom, the temperature dropped dramatically. It was as though the basement was alive, exhaling a cold, unnatural breath that made his skin crawl. He fumbled for another light switch but found nothing. The basement remained dark, save for the faint glow of moonlight streaming through a small, broken window near the ceiling. He could see shapes in the shadows. Old, rotting furniture covered in dust. Piles of boxes that had been abandoned and forgotten. The air smelled stale, like the basement hadn't been disturbed in years. But it was the shadows that caught his attention. They moved. At first, it was subtle. A flicker here, a slight shift there. But then they began to grow, stretching across the floor, up the walls, as though they were alive, inching closer to him. His heart raced, and he stepped backward, his eyes wide in disbelief. There were whispers now, faint but growing louder, circling around him in a language he didn't understand. The shadows seemed to twist and warp in response, their forms becoming sharper, more defined. "Leave," the whisper echoed in his mind, reverberating through his skull as if it came from inside his very bones. Henry stumbled backward, his breath quickening, his mind struggling to process what was happening. He turned to run but found himself rooted to the spot. The shadows were no longer just around him. They were in him, filling his mind, twisting his thoughts, pushing him into an overwhelming sense of dread. Another whisper, louder this time. "Help me." It was a child's voice, distorted, hollow, as though it had been trapped for years, forgotten and abandoned. Henry's pulse hammered in his ears. He wasn't sure if he was still in the basement, or if the shadows had consumed him entirely. The whispers grew, louder and more desperate, the shadows now closing in on him, surrounding him on all sides. He ran, up the stairs, through the door, and into the hallway. The basement door slammed shut behind him with a deafening crash, but the whispers didn't stop. They followed him, filling his ears, louder and more insistent. "Help me!" He pressed his back against the door, gasping for breath. The house was silent once more, but the presence of something dark, something ancient hung in the air. And from that day on, Henry could never escape the whispers. They followed him through every room in the house, through the halls, and even into his dreams. Every night when the lights went out, the shadows would return, and they would whisper, always whispering. Story 6. The basement had always been a forbidden place. Even the floorboards above it seemed to groan under the weight of its secrets, vibrating with a sense of unease that only grew stronger over time. The house on Oak Ridge Lane had stood for over a century, and in all that time it had earned a reputation. The neighborhood kids dared each other to get close, but none of them would ever approach the front door. There was something about the place, something in the air, that made the house feel wrong, and it all began with the basement. No one knew who had built the house or who had lived there first. The old records were lost in time, and the history was buried under layers of dust and decay. The house had been vacant for years when Julia moved in. Drawn to its old-world charm and the promise of a fresh start, she was tired of city life, of the constant noise and bustle. The house was exactly what she needed, a quiet, peaceful escape. But from the moment she stepped inside, something didn't feel right. The first few days were fine. The house had a certain eerie charm. Its wooden floors creaked with every step, and the air smelled of dust and old wood, but nothing out of the ordinary. It was on the fourth night, however, when the whispers began. It started softly, like a draft slipping through the cracks in the walls. But soon, the whispers grew louder, coming from the direction of the basement. She tried to ignore them, assuming it was just the house settling or maybe the wind. But the sounds persisted, growing in intensity until they filled the entire house. One night, unable to sleep, Julia found herself standing in front of the basement door. The key was in her hand, cold and heavy, though she didn't remember taking it. The whispers were louder now, a low, guttural sound that rattled her bones. The door was locked when she moved in, but tonight it was calling to her. With trembling hands, she unlocked the door. The air in the basement was thick, damp, and oppressive. The steps creaked beneath her as she descended, the dark, suffocating space pulling her deeper into its grip. The shadows here seemed different, denser, colder. She could feel them pressing in on her, following her every move, and then she saw it. A figure standing in the far corner of the basement, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall, featureless, its shape shifting and writhing like smoke. Julia froze, unable to look away. The figure didn't move, but the shadows around it seemed to pulse as though it were feeding off the darkness. And then it spoke. "Come closer." The voice was not human. It was a hollow sound, as if it were being whispered through layers of time and space. Julia's heart raced, but she couldn't move. The darkness had its grip on her, tightening with every second. "Come closer." She stumbled backward, her foot catching on a loose floorboard. The shadows seemed to shift, crawling toward her like a living thing. The temperature in the room dropped, the air turning frigid and suffocating. "Leave." The voice was louder now, desperate, but the shadows pressed in on her, their form taking shape around her like hands reaching out of the darkness. In a panic, Julia turned and fled, her breath ragged, her heart pounding in her chest. She slammed the basement door shut behind her, the whispers still echoing in her ears. She never returned to the basement again. But the shadows didn't stay in the basement. They followed her, lurking in every corner, every dark space. The whispers never stopped, and every night as the house grew still and the shadows deepened, she could hear it. Come closer. And no matter how far she ran, she would never escape.